After spending more than 2 decades paying attention to relationship dynamics, I've noticed a pattern that keeps appearing with emotionally avoidant people. They can walk away from relationships that, from an outside perspective, seem incredibly difficult to leave. They can create distance from someone who is kind, loyal, patient, understanding, and genuinely sincere. They may have a person beside them who respects their need for space, honors their boundaries, avoids unnecessary pressure, and offers the steady affection that so many people long to receive. And somehow, even with all of that, the avoidant person can still pull away. Yet every so often, someone enters their life who affects them differently. They may have seemed perfectly comfortable living independently, keeping people at a safe distance and relying mostly on themselves. Then they encounter a certain kind of person, and something beneath the surface begins to move. That encounter does not guarantee a lasting relationship. It does not suddenly make them emotionally secure or erase years of protective habits. It may not even lead to the happy ending either person imagined, but it can touch emotional places that ordinary relationships never manage to reach. That is the person I want to explore with you. And if you are listening to this and parts of the description feel strangely familiar, there is a chance you recognize yourself in it. The empath who leaves the strongest impression on an avoidant is not necessarily the person who loves them with the greatest intensity. It isn't automatically the person who waits endlessly, accommodates everything, or repeatedly reshapes their own needs so the avoidant never has to feel uncomfortable. Those qualities may come from genuine kindness and a very loving heart. But sometimes they unintentionally strengthen the very defenses they are trying to soften. Why does that happen? Because underneath avoidant behavior, there is often a strong sensitivity to emotional expectations. When someone seems to need them intensely, when another person's happiness or stability appears heavily connected to their presence, the relationship can begin to feel less like affection and more like responsibility. Even sincere love can register as pressure when it carries an expectation that the other person must respond in a certain way. The person who reaches an avoidant at a deeper level tends to be different. I would describe this person as having a kind of grounded emotional depth. They feel deeply. They notice subtle shifts in tone, behavior, energy, and mood. They can recognize emotions that other people may overlook completely. Their sensitivity is powerful and sometimes almost instinctive, but they don't allow every feeling to dictate what they do next. They have spent enough time examining themselves to understand that experiencing an emotion strongly does not mean they have to act on it immediately. They have known disappointment, they have faced loneliness, they have lived through uncertainty, and encountered parts of themselves that were uncomfortable to confront. Through those experiences, they learned how to sit with difficult emotions without letting those emotions take control of their choices. Their sensitivity became a source of strength rather than something fragile that needed constant protection. This person can care about an avoidant deeply without making that person responsible for keeping them emotionally okay. They can want them tremendously. They can feel a connection they struggle to explain. They can miss them intensely, but their emotional stability does not depend on whether the avoidant decides to move closer today. That distinction matters because the typical avoidant pursuer pattern is heavily influenced by perceived emotional pressure. One person reaches toward greater intimacy. The avoidant senses expectations building and steps backward. The other person notices the withdrawal and becomes more anxious, so they reach even harder. The avoidant experiences even more pressure and creates additional distance. Before long, both people are responding to each other's reactions, trapped in a cycle that keeps reinforcing itself. But the deeply grounded empath responds in another way. When the avoidant retreats, they don't immediately chase after them. That doesn't mean the distance doesn't hurt. In fact, they may feel it more deeply than most people realize. The difference is how they process that pain. Instead of immediately moving outward in search of reassurance, they turn inward. They regulate themselves. They reconnect with their own identity. They return to the routines, friendships, interests, goals, and responsibilities that existed before the relationship. They remind themselves that another person's temporary unavailability does not determine their value. They don't abandon themselves simply because someone else has taken a step backward. And this is where the avoidant person's familiar pattern can suddenly become difficult to understand. The withdrawal happens, but there is no frantic pursuit afterward. There is no emotional negotiation, no dramatic attempt to force closeness, and no desperate demand for answers. There is simply space. The avoidant suddenly has nothing obvious to resist. There is no overwhelming emotional dependence confirming the belief that intimacy will eventually become suffocating. There is no intense pursuit that allows them to maintain distance while still feeling completely in control. Instead, they are facing someone who remains emotionally present while staying firmly rooted in themselves. That kind of calm can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, because the avoidant may be accustomed to relationships where they are either idealized or eventually blamed for failing to meet someone's emotional expectations. The grounded empath does neither. They see the human being beneath the protective behavior. They notice the contradictions. They appreciate genuine tenderness when it appears, but they also recognize withdrawal, inconsistency, emotional deflection, and unavailability when those things are present. They don't pretend the difficult parts don't exist, but they also don't turn those difficult parts into reasons to attack, shame, or punish the other person. They can see clearly and remain compassionate at the same time. That combination is uncommon. Being understood without being placed on a pedestal is rare. Being seen accurately without immediately being criticized can be even rarer. And for someone who has spent years protecting themselves through emotional distance, being genuinely seen can feel deeply disorienting because the defenses that once seemed necessary suddenly have less work to do. Those walls were built to protect against people who demanded too much, misunderstood their boundaries, became dependent on them, or eventually became angry when they couldn't provide the closeness those people wanted. And that realization can create a completely different kind of awareness. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant begins to understand that this person is not waiting outside the door, hoping to be invited in. They have their own life, their own direction, and their own sense of identity. They can remain caring without remaining endlessly available. They can leave without turning their departure into a punishment. And that can challenge one of the deepest assumptions behind avoidant behavior, the belief that closeness automatically means losing freedom. With this kind of person, closeness does not require surrender. Love does not demand possession. Connection does not erase individuality. The empath demonstrates through their actions that two people can care deeply for each other while still remaining whole within themselves. That is something the avoidant may have rarely experienced. Instead of feeling trapped by another person's emotional needs, they begin to see that healthy connection can actually create more freedom, not less. The relationship becomes less about managing another person's reactions and more about two individuals choosing to share their lives. And this is where the grounded empath becomes especially powerful, not because they know how to manipulate the avoidant, but because they refuse to participate in the old cycle. They do not chase when distance appears. They do not punish when communication becomes difficult. They do not turn silence into a competition. They simply remain honest about what they feel while staying anchored in what they need. If the avoidant reaches toward them, they respond with openness. If the avoidant pulls away, they allow the distance to exist without abandoning themselves. This consistency creates something the avoidant may find surprisingly safe. There is no emotional ambush waiting around the corner. There is no hidden contract demanding that every moment of closeness be repaid. There is simply a person who can say, "I care about you, but I will not lose myself trying to convince you to stay." And that message can reach deeper than any speech ever could. Because underneath the avoidance defenses is often a person who wants connection but fears what connection might cost. They may fear disappointing someone. They may fear being controlled. They may fear becoming responsible for another person's happiness. They may fear being exposed and then rejected. But when they encounter someone who does not demand that they abandon themselves in order to be loved, the equation begins to change. Suddenly, intimacy becomes less threatening. It becomes a choice rather than an obligation. The empath is not removing the avoidance fears for them. They are simply creating a relationship in which those fears do not have to control every decision. And there is an important distinction here. Being this kind of empath does not mean tolerating inconsistency forever. It does not mean accepting emotional neglect because you understand where it comes from. Understanding someone's wounds does not require you to live inside the consequences of those wounds. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Real emotional strength means being able to say, I understand why you struggle with closeness and I still need consistency. Those two truths can exist together. You can understand someone without excusing everything they do. You can love someone without remaining in a relationship that repeatedly hurts you. You can recognize someone's potential without making that potential your responsibility. And when the empath truly understands this, something inside them becomes quieter. They stop trying to prove that they are different from everyone who came before. They stop trying to become impossible to leave. They stop searching for the perfect words that will finally make the avoidant understand their value. Instead, they allow their value to exist without explanation. This is the point where sensitivity becomes sovereignty. They still feel deeply, perhaps even more deeply than before, but they no longer allow every emotional wave to dictate their behavior. They can miss someone and continue their day. They can feel disappointed and still protect their peace. They can love someone and still walk away when the relationship no longer supports their well-being. That is not emotional detachment, it is emotional freedom. And ironically, that freedom may be one of the things the avoidant notices most. Not because it is designed to make them chase, but because it reveals something they may have struggled to believe, that love can exist without control. Someone can care deeply and still remain independent. Someone can be emotionally available without becoming emotionally dependent. Someone can see the walls and still refuse to spend their entire life trying to tear them down. And once the avoidant encounters that kind of connection, the usual defenses may not work in quite the same way. They cannot create distance and automatically assume the other person will chase. They cannot withdraw and immediately feel completely safe because the other person's calm response forces them to encounter themselves. They may begin asking questions they previously avoided. Why did I pull away? Why did their closeness feel threatening? Why do I miss them now that they are no longer pursuing me? Why did I feel safer when they stopped asking me to come closer? Those questions do not guarantee change. Awareness is not transformation. The avoidant still has to choose to examine their patterns, communicate honestly, and develop a greater capacity for intimacy. No empath, no matter how emotionally intelligent, can do that work for them. But sometimes one relationship can become a mirror that makes the old pattern impossible to ignore. The deeply grounded empath becomes that mirror not by forcing reflection, but by refusing to distort themselves to make the other person comfortable. They show up honestly. They care without controlling. They maintain boundaries without hostility. They offer closeness without demanding surrender. And if the avoidant is willing to grow, that kind of relationship can become an opportunity to experience something entirely different from the relationships that shaped their defenses. A connection where both people can breathe. A connection where space does not automatically mean abandonment and closeness does not automatically mean captivity. A connection where love is not a test, a performance, or a transaction, but whether the avoidant chooses to grow is ultimately their decision. Your responsibility is not to become the perfect person who finally heals them. Your responsibility is to remain connected to yourself. Because the deepest form of empathy is not losing yourself inside someone else's emotional world. It is being able to understand another person's pain while still honoring your own reality. And perhaps that is the quality that affects an avoidant most deeply. Not endless patience, not perfect understanding, not chasing them through every period of distance. It is the quiet strength of someone who can say, I see you clearly. I understand that you are afraid. I care about you deeply, and I will still choose myself. That is not rejection. That is not punishment. That is love with boundaries. And sometimes, that is the first kind of love that allows another person to finally understand what genuine connection can feel like. They understand that seeing someone's pattern does not give them the responsibility to fix it. They can recognize the fear beneath the withdrawal without taking ownership of that fear. They can understand why the avoidant behaves the way they do, while still allowing the avoidant to face the consequences of those choices. That is one of the hardest forms of love because it requires compassion without rescue. The empath does not say, I will stay here until you finally become ready. They say, I understand you, but you have to decide what you want to do with what you understand about yourself. And that distinction protects both people. It allows the avoidant to retain responsibility for their own growth, while allowing the empath to remain responsible for their own boundaries, needs, and direction. The relationship can no longer function as a rehabilitation project. It becomes a choice between two people who are capable of deciding whether they can meet each other in a healthy way. And if the avoidant begins to reflect honestly, they may discover something uncomfortable but liberating. The person they feared would demand too much may have actually been offering them something they had never learned to receive. Not constant reassurance, not unlimited access, not emotional dependence, simply genuine connection without the requirement that either person disappear inside it. This can challenge the avoidant's understanding of what intimacy means. Perhaps intimacy is not losing yourself in someone else. Perhaps it is allowing someone to know you while remaining yourself. Perhaps commitment does not have to mean captivity. Perhaps vulnerability does not automatically end with humiliation or rejection. And perhaps needing someone sometimes does not make you weak. These realizations can take time. They may come in fragments rather than one dramatic breakthrough. A memory here, a moment of regret there, a quiet recognition that the connection felt different from what they were accustomed to. Sometimes the significance of a person becomes clearer only after the emotional intensity has settled. When there is no longer a constant interaction distracting the mind, the deeper meaning of the relationship can become easier to notice. The avoidant may begin remembering how peaceful it felt to be around someone who did not demand a performance. They may remember that they were allowed to be imperfect without immediately being punished for it. They may remember conversations where silence did not feel awkward, moments where they could simply exist without explaining themselves. Those details can become meaningful because they represent something beyond attraction. They represent psychological safety. But again, recognizing that safety does not guarantee that the avoidant will know how to maintain it. Someone can understand what they lost and still lack the skills required to build something healthier. They can miss someone and still remain afraid of closeness. They can experience regret without being ready for accountability. They can want connection while continuing to protect themselves from it. This is why the empath must never confuse emotional significance with relational capacity. Someone can feel deeply and still be unable to offer a stable relationship. Someone can care and still behave inconsistently. Someone can recognize your value and still not be capable of meeting you where you are. Those distinctions matter because otherwise empathy becomes an excuse to remain in situations that repeatedly drain you. The sovereign empath does not need that excuse. They can appreciate the connection without worshiping it. They can acknowledge what was beautiful without denying what was painful. They can remember the good moments without rewriting the difficult ones. They can leave the door open emotionally without standing in the doorway waiting. And that is perhaps the greatest difference between this person and the anxious pursuer. The pursuer often asks, "What can I do to make this person choose me?" The sovereign empath eventually asks a different question. Is this relationship capable of meeting me with the same honesty and consistency that I am willing to bring? That question changes everything. It moves the focus away from earning love and toward recognizing compatibility. It stops turning another person's defenses into a personal challenge. It stops treating distance as something that must be conquered, and it creates room for a much healthier truth. Love is not proven by how much discomfort you are willing to tolerate. Understanding someone does not require you to abandon your standards. Patience does not mean waiting indefinitely. Compassion does not mean accepting everything. You can care about someone's wounds while refusing to let those wounds determine the shape of your life. This is why the grounded empath can leave such a lasting impression. They do not become unforgettable because they manipulate absence or manufacture jealousy. They become memorable because they offer something unusual, emotional depth without emotional captivity. They are capable of seeing another person clearly while continuing to see themselves clearly too. And if the avoidant eventually grows, that memory may become an important reference point. It may remind them that there was once someone who offered closeness without control, honesty without cruelty, and understanding without self-abandonment. Perhaps that experience becomes a doorway into deeper self-awareness. Perhaps it encourages them to examine the beliefs that once made intimacy feel dangerous. Perhaps it helps them recognize that their defenses protected them once, but may now be preventing them from receiving the very connection they desire. But whether that realization ever happens is not something the empath can control. That is the final lesson. Your emotional intelligence cannot do another person's healing. Your patience cannot create their readiness. Your love cannot force them to confront what they avoid. You can offer understanding, but they must choose growth. You can offer connection, but they must choose participation. You can offer honesty, but they must choose to respond honestly. And if they cannot, then your task is not to wait for potential to become reality. Your task is to continue becoming the fullest version of yourself. That is what sovereign empathy really means. It is not simply feeling other people's emotions. It is knowing yourself well enough that another person's fear does not become your identity. It is being compassionate without becoming consumed. It is loving without abandoning your own center. It is understanding someone without needing to rescue them. And perhaps the most powerful thing you can communicate through that way of living is simple. I can see you, I can care about you, and I can still choose myself. That is not a wall, it is a boundary. It is not emotional distance, it is emotional maturity. And when two people eventually meet from that level of awareness, connection no longer has to be a battle between closeness and freedom. It can become something much simpler and much healthier. Two whole people choosing to walk beside each other without either one having to disappear. They no longer need to convince the avoidant that the connection mattered because they have stopped measuring their worth through another person's ability to recognize it. They can honor what they felt without turning that feeling into a lifelong obligation. They can remember the moments of closeness, the conversations, the tenderness, and the strange sense of recognition without allowing those memories to become reasons to remain stuck. This is where emotional sovereignty becomes real. It is not about becoming detached or pretending nothing affected you. It is about becoming secure enough within yourself that you no longer need another person's response to tell you what your experience was worth. You can acknowledge that something mattered and still accept that it may not be capable of becoming the relationship you hoped for. And sometimes that acceptance is the moment the entire dynamic begins to lose its power over you. You stop watching for signs. You stop analyzing every message. You stop asking friends what they think the silence means. You stop constructing elaborate explanations for behavior that may never receive an explanation. Instead, you return to what you actually know. You know what you experienced. You know what you need. You know what you are willing to give, and you know what you are no longer willing to sacrifice. That clarity is incredibly freeing because uncertainty survives through constant attention. The more you feed it with speculation, the larger it becomes. But when you stop trying to solve another person's internal world, your own world becomes available again.